Chants of Sennaar is a puzzle game developed by French indie studio Rundisk with an elegant score written by Thomas Brunet. It has been largely acclaimed since its release in September 2023 thanks to its captivating core idea, deciphering the 5 languages of Sennaar's peoples, and its meticulous, effective art direction which takes advantage of the developer's time constraints, blending many influences and showing great elegance. As its name suggests, Chants of Sennaar takes us on an exploration of the Tower of Babel, where the famous myth took place. The story is loosely based on Sade myth. The 5 peoples of the tower have isolated themselves from each other, destroying the links that once existed between some of them. We must learn to decipher the different languages spoken in the land of Sennaar in order to connect its peoples again. To do this, we have a notebook on which we draw. Each drawing corresponds to a symbol read or heard on one of the floors. We can give each symbol a temporary translation in order to make the dialogues and inscriptions easier to understand as we progress through the floor, but this is not taken into account when validating the answers. On each double page of the notebook there are several drawings, and if we associate the right symbol with each drawing, the answers for the double page are validated, regardless of the translation we had assigned to the symbols. So it works like Return of the Obra Dinn, which requires us to correctly fill in 3 or 2 fates for the results to be confirmed. It works in stages. Armed only with this notebook, the hero of Chants of Sennaar confronts the impressive construction, patiently deciphering Babel's 5 languages in order to put an end to its hierarchy, bringing movement to a place that is now frozen, a discreet and empathetic figure revealing the history of its peoples, sometimes giving a voice to those who have become almost silent through Thomas Brunet's music. Chants of Sennaar has been widely covered in the video games press, and I'm not pretending to make an entirely new and exhaustive analysis of the work. This is my vision of the game, yet many of the points I detail are often addressed by the developers and the composer. For my part, I watched Rundisk's interview in Rencontre en Terre Indé, presented by Atomium and Mr. MV, and read the interview with Thomas Brunet for Now Playing, Peter Line 6's former website entirely devoted to video game music, as well as another interview with Thomas Brunet and Julien Moya for JV France. In addition to this, you'll find in the description other articles and interviews on several aspects I don't cover in the video. Now that I'm done with the introduction, let's go. In Chants of Sennaar, the developers wanted to highlight another kind of heroism, emphasizing humility rather than strength. Almost all the elements involved in our deciphering the languages, whether they're interactions or puzzles, are based on observation and reflection. In this regard, the first appearance of the playable character is very meaningful. The camera elegantly reveals a high platform with endless lines that turn out to be the hero's silhouette. As if he were in a mold, making him, even before we're told, a key, and not really human. This mold seems to have a current running through it. He suddenly appears, and without having time to wonder where he is, emerges from this hidden room to explore the tower's 5 floors and decipher the languages of its peoples. There's no emphasis, no intensity. No sooner is he created than he starts walking, his face hidden, his posture a little stooped. Is there, that's almost all. The music is just as simple. There are 3 phrases and a sting. The first is played by the cello, elegant but very short, a musical gesture that could be played in a single breath if it were done on a wind instrument, to which the violin responds very simply with 3 notes. The startup of the sarcophagus is accompanied by a sound effect, and it's the oboe that briefly concludes this introduction. Coupled with the English horn, this is the instrument that the composer, Thomas Brunet, wanted, at least initially, to associate with the hero. All this takes more time to explain than to look at. Everything is very pared down, therefore effective. The hero is immediately shown as being on the side, apart. This room is reachable only by breaking through a wall of the tower, and the playable character can be thought to be made from scratch. Even the first musical phrase on the cello highlights a form of humility. It's the work's main theme, or at least a motif that will be heard regularly, right up to the end, but as it's stated in the opening, I imagine it's the main theme. It's not repeated, it's simply stated once, and again there's no emphasis, even musically. Compare it with any other main theme, most of the time there's a focus on it, for example in Planet of Lana, whose OST I'm listening to a lot at the moment. Exposing a sound signal used in the very universe of Planet of Lana, it is slow and takes time to develop, making the most of the contrast between the clarity of the piano and the softness, the oneirism even of the strings that accompany it. Our attention is entirely focused on it. In-game, however, it's a little different. After hearing the motif very briefly, we quickly move on to a more upbeat music depicting life in the village of Lana and her sister Ilo. But once again, it's a music that takes up space. It's particularly cinematic, like all of Takeshi Furukawa's OST. In Spiritfarer, which I'll be analyzing on the channel at some point, the main motifs are presented with solemnity, just like the task Sharon is now handing down to Stella, whether in the menu loop or in the game's introduction. And of course, there's Journey. Obviously a character with a hidden face, dressed in red, a game partly about language. Well, I'll tell you right now, the two games are very different, opposed even in some respects. But as I was listening to Chants of Sennaar's OST, I briefly thought about Journey precisely because, although they both feature the cello in the opening, there's a clear difference. While Journey may be about a quest for individuality, Chants of Sennaar is not, and the hero's mission is the only thing that matters, by which I mean that the game is not about discovering who he is. If you listen to the beginning of Journey's OST, the way the main theme is stated, it's different in-game though. The first note alone honors the instrument, the beauty and the depth of Tinaguo's tone, her vibrato, and the theme, made up of several phrases, takes the time to develop, with, in particular, this beautiful accent on the D before the end. I already mentioned this in my video on Journey. It's an affirmation of the traveler's voice, a solemn statement, just as the first chart of their face immediately draws us into a form of identification. In-game, it's first a call of the cello, lost in the chaos of the orchestra, then the traveler appears. Back to Chants of Sennaar. The difference is striking. Even tonally, it's a little uncertain. There's no solid assertion of a key, F minor, G minor, and as each instrument plays a very short phrase, it's not really clear at first whether one of them will actually get the upper hand, so to speak, in the music. After this very short introduction, the diegetic silence dominates, at first a slightly heavy ambient layer that quickly softens with the sound of water, a few achievement stingers, and the elegant and precise sound design of Roman Cabezos. After the devotee opens the door, we finally discover what's inside the tower, and here the music opens up to a certain solemnity and expectation. There's something extremely precise about this opening. This time, the initial motif is highlighted. It's found in several pieces from the devotee's music, and so is every instrument, although they're not all introduced with the same place in the counterpoint. This is to be expected, as this is a much more constructed piece than the few initial phrases. While the playable character is introduced musically with humility but a certain mystery, it's clearly different for the tower, or at least its first floor, the very place where the quest begins. The hero's quest is not about him, it's entirely about the tower and its people, their language. So he remains completely anonymous to us, and to him, by which I mean that it's not a matter of discovering who he is. It seems to me that it's not a matter of reflecting on his individuality. We don't identify with him, but with his quest, which we embrace completely since we're doing exactly what he's doing. The link is made tangible thanks to the main element of decipherment, the notebook, which belongs to the character. We see him taking notes. This also highlights the idea of observation, of patience, something which the places will also suggest. I'll come back to this. Just like our arrival on the first floor of the tower through a hole in the wall, we're often either discreet or in hiding. The game includes a few infiltration phases, notably among the warriors, the only people truly hostile to our presence. The first third of this zone is explored stealth. The omnipresence of the notion of hierarchy, that of the tower, to which we don't belong at all, often leads us to pass through back doors, secret passages. Most of the peoples welcome us rather positively, but don't open their doors to us unconditionally. We still have to hide, find other ways in, or even explore what's underneath some of the areas. The pace of the game is also reminiscent of a form of discretion in that I often had the feeling that I'd never linger on one floor of the tower. As soon as I had learned one language, I would move on to the next, which can happen all the faster, as the game is quite generous when it comes to learning languages. You can move on to the next floor even if you haven't deciphered all the symbols of a language. This happened to me when I went from the warriors to the bards, for example. Some balancing was necessary, however, to ensure a minimum knowledge of the glyphs and that you don't rush through the levels. That would also take us away from the hero's mission. The character never stands completely upright and moves rather furtively. He is not here to impose himself visually. Even his clothes, although they are similar to those of the others, all the characters except the anchorites, whose legs are visible, wear a robe or a tunic, are different enough for us to identify him immediately as someone else. The bards can see that he is neither a warrior nor one of them. Even when he has to wear the clothes of a people among the warriors, his posture, unchanged, makes him stand out. The warriors are proudly marching, the hero is discreet. This very humble physical and moral stance is reinforced by that of the other characters, which is always very assertive. There's a lot of emphasis, as we'll see later, whatever their personality, their nature. This is all the more true of the bard aesthetes, whose first lines of dialogue include "Beauty I love" and "Beauty I am." They are readily associated with a certain narcissism that leads to the enslavement of some of their fellow people. We'll see later that among them, what seems ugly is mocked or hidden, especially work. Beyond his physical appearance, seeing him moving in places and among NPCs that are mostly static underlines his difference. Interactions mostly involve dialogues. The hero interrupts NPCs or groups of NPCs whose attitude or occupation allows us to guess the meaning of some of the symbols. He navigates from one to another while the NPCs remain either static or locked in cycles, like those whom the bard call idiots, working tirelessly. He is active in the tower in contrast to the inhabitants, now passive in their relationship with the other peoples. His relation to the world is fundamentally different from that of the tower's inhabitants, although he often behaves like them. He hides among the devotees, disguises himself as a warrior, works alongside the alchemists. In the infiltration phases, the hero is even more cautious, his posture is different, and we never see him get the upper hand on anyone. If he's discovered or when he's being attacked, he barely protects himself or is shown trying to calm the creatures down. He never shows strength or even power. He's definitely not the assertive kind. Although he learns to decipher the 5 languages of the Tower of Babel, the playable character is silent. He is often thanked, but never answers, stepping aside in a way to highlight his quest. He is a key, fulfilling his function and nothing more. This changes slightly at the end with the child. He can't confront people directly, so it's through the teleportation terminals that he recreates links between inhabitants without being seen. They're not aware that someone is helping them communicate until the end of the game. The hero is therefore in a horizontal relationship to the others. Although he's portrayed as apart, he puts himself at the level of each people to then destroy the verticality of the tower. This is not a game that emphasizes teamwork as Tears of the Kingdom did last year. It's about a character who works alone to connect the peoples. The ending, the good ending, doesn't show many people together. There's no crowd to congratulate the hero, just a few representatives of each people. Rather than depicting a realistic or teeming place, Rundisk has opted for a certain purity in its designs due to the studio's limited production capacity. I'll talk about this a little later, as well as the choices made for the graphics. Even so, the Tower of Babel is not without grandeur. Efficiency and clarity do not detract from its imposing character and dimensions, which are not, however, emphasized in the same way on every floor. The first contact with the building is impressive, with an immense platform at the very top of which the hero is standing. The acoustics always well chosen, we start with a generous reverb, and this very beautiful shot of the waterways. The entrance to the devotees' floor somewhat softens that previous feeling of immensity, because even if there are relatively few of them and the place still seems vast on our scale, there is no longer this initial vertigo. With the warriors, on the other hand, we immediately disappear. The camera is zoomed out and will never appear so small, lost in the pure lines of the entrance to their floor. With the alchemists, it's the other way round. In the mine, they're the ones looking all tiny in the background. Although some floors may already seem relatively vast, ultimately we are only seeing a fraction of the tower. We do not pretend to explore it in its entirety. From the very first floor, designed as a large abbey but with the verticality of a cathedral, we can see flying buttresses, for example, staircases multiply. We won't be able to take them all. Being aware of the tower's dimensions underlies a form of patience in the hero's mission. It's an imposing, impressive monument which must be approached with modesty and intelligence. We're not much when confronted with a warrior or a monster. It also implies patience in the learning process. As you climb the floors, you're confronted with more and more symbols more and more quickly. Apart from a few greetings, you have to accept that you won't understand everything right away. The anchorites floor, however, shows a completely different rhythm. Almost none of the anchorites speak to us, so learning is essentially a matter of correspondence, testing our knowledge of the languages we previously deciphered. Moreover, the hero does almost everything on his own. The anchorites and the child do help him at the end, but he's mostly isolated during his adventure, a small silhouette relentlessly going from one floor of the Tower of Babel to another. We can also feel this humility through the music. Thomas Brunet mainly uses small, even very small ensembles. He worked with only a few instrumentalists, violin, cello, flute, oboe, clarinet and voice, but there are moments when you need something larger, in which case the orchestral parts are not recorded live but are VSTs, mainly strings. Nevertheless, if some events in this Tower of Babel call for grandeur, it's relatively short-lived and the mass quickly disappears, returning to something more intimate. For example, when the warrior's bell puzzle is successfully completed, we hear the call. The warriors have been waiting forever for the chosen ones to come. That's why you need to translate this sense of accomplishment, which there is at the beginning. But as I said, the hero never lingers on any floor. He's patient, but once his mission is accomplished, he moves on to the next. If he is occasionally thanked, he always leaves without a word. The music quickly makes an about-face, returning to a much softer atmosphere, similar to that of the music normally heard in this area, somewhat sheltered from the warriors. The voice is used with the same restraint, and even when it's a solo voice, it remains in communion with the orchestra or the ensemble. The notion of humility runs through every aspect of the art direction and the game, which ends joyfully yet with restraint. If we don't recreate any of the links in the tower, the notebook disappears and it's almost as if the instrumentalists are gathering for a final, very short lament, less than a minute and a half, with most of the credits running in silence. If we recreate all the links, we are greeted by the orchestra before the sound mask gradually diminishes, first leaving a little room for the exclamations of the peoples, taking up the theme that had opened the game, then gently accompanying the credits. If there's greatness, it always fades very quickly. There's also a fair amount of diegetic silence, since there are no uninterrupted musical loops in the floors. Generally, there's a pause of just over a minute between two iterations of a piece. What's more, when you leave a zone with music and then return to it, the music picks up right where it stopped. If it was towards the end of the loop, we are back to silence fairly quickly. Some areas have no non-diegetic music, which can enhance the game's few, rather discrete diegetic musics, or musics that are non-diegetic but have a key function, such as when the playable character finally discovers what's outside the tower. Humility can also be applied to the development of Chants of Sennaar. Rundisk is a very small team made up of Julien Moya and Thomas Panuel, the latter having a paid job. A few artists have been hired for the drawings from the notebook, the sound design and the music, and as Focus Entertainment decided to publish the game, Julien Moya was able to dedicate more time to the development, but it's a project that was essentially carried out in the developer's spare time. The latter therefore often stress the importance of efficiency in their process, so as not to create issues that would be too complex to solve, a very acute awareness of their production capacity, coupled with a rather impressive ability to think ahead of the game in a way. It was important not to think too big and that the game be designed with great adaptability in mind, the concept of modularity being often mentioned by the developers. And it paid off, development was crunch-free. The second aspect is that the development was very linear, following almost exactly the flow of the game. There were many iterations, but few major changes in terms of level design. Although the developers subsequently had greater resources at their disposal, they remained modest for the sake of consistency between the first and last levels. Indeed, the game has this very measured, very balanced aspect. Nothing ever seems too much, but nothing is lacking either. So a lot is suggested rather than shown, but in the context of the game and its key notion of humility, it's a choice that was really successful. For instance, all the characters are masked. While this allows not to have to animate faces, it also gives the impression that the character's emotions are limited, that they are barely touched on. Some emotions are accessible through animation, since there's a vocabulary of emotions to be translated, notably the verb to love, or a situation to be explained, the distress of the devotees in front of the closed door. But it's really only with the bards that people evoke, directly or indirectly, more precise and varied emotions, the satisfaction, admittedly somewhat constrained, of some, and the wish for emancipation of others. Before that, however, two characters depart slightly from this treatment. There's the bell ringer among the warriors, the only character who isn't masked. We see his profile through the window of his tiny shelter, then his silhouette from behind, as he enjoys the bottle we brought him on the shelter's roof. As this is the only face we see, indirectly no less, it makes the scene rather moving, as the bell ringer's weakness, the warriors make fun of him as they say he's an alcoholic, is associated with the vision of a lonely man. We get the impression that he spends his days locked up there, waiting to ring several calls, including one most unlikely, that of the chosen ones, the bards, who have no intention of coming down to see the warriors. In a context where all differences are erased by the uniform and the mask, the face is a reminder of the individual. We could imagine something similar in the observatory, but it's empty. The second character with visible emotions, at least more open than the others, on whom I'll dwell a little later, is the child. He interrupts our discovery of the devotees, bringing a joyful, obvious, instinctive element, play, into an exploration hitherto mostly based on observation and logic. More demonstrative than the others, he's the only one to greet the hero when the characters all meet at the top of the tower, after he has helped the latter free himself from Exile's grip. As the playable character's emotions are almost invisible, although some are suggested by a few animations, he comes across as a rather imperturbable person, and the use of ellipses, sometimes for the sake of efficiency, can bring a touch of humor, although this is a very personal feeling. In the infiltration phases, for instance, notably in the Abbey, when you're spotted by the devotees, you immediately jump to the conclusion. The powerless hero is back to the closed door. You can hear the door slamming, but you can't see the devotees throwing the playable character out. I tend to imagine him being ejected rather frankly. Later in the meal, there's a brief ellipsis just as we retrieve the torch. The hero immediately exits the meal. How did he do it, you might ask? I don't know why, but I started picturing him surrounded by sacks of flour, and that amused me. More seriously, no human violence is shown towards the hero. During the stealth sequences, when the hero is spotted, we never see any aggression, any blow. A silhouette appears on the screen, and then, after a blinking effect, which we also see in the transitions when we change rooms, the gameplay resumes. The fact that even the warrior's physical violence is not depicted, only suggested, if at all, contributes to the game's style and message. The playable character doesn't show physical strength, neither do the other characters. Only the violence of the robots is visible. The Tower of Babel is no paradise, however, the warrior's treasure is certainly tinged with violence, and above all, we'll see later that some inhabitants can be enslaved within their own people. Suggesting can be much more powerful than showing. On the alchemist's floor, the third laboratory bears the traces of a very violent confrontation. Looking through a trapdoor, you can hear, without seeing anything, the rattle of a monster. Or when the bell ringer opens the door to get the bottle we just put in front of his shelter, you can hear it. That's enough. On the other hand, although emotions are barely visible, they are audible. Because of his particular role, the playable character is very empathetic, and discovering the different floors of the tower, exploring these places makes it possible for him to reveal to us what is supposedly hidden, or at least hidden from the other people, since each floor is now sealed, inaccessible to the others. The link between the playable character and the music is manifold. Sometimes the music expresses what he's feeling. In Catch Me, the warrior's infiltration music, or the softer music in the areas where we're alone. I'll come back to those a little later. At other times, it allows the people to speak at last, thanks to the hero's presence, as we'll see later with the bards. But the two roles can mix, especially on the last floor, that of the anchorites, that of exile, from which rises a lament that can't really be that of a people rendered almost silent by isolation. At least they don't speak to others, but would seem almost too intense for a character that's just been created. Likewise, in the short music of the bad ending, there may also be a little of the tower, in addition to the saddened hero, expressing itself. Moreover, where the oboe was originally intended to represent the playable character, yet it's an idea that was still partially used, the cello was intended to be the voice of the tower itself, proof that it is in some way personified, animated. It didn't take long for Rundisk to decide on the art direction for Chants of Sennaar, and this was the first stage of development, even before the gameplay. Each floor focuses on a limited but often highly distinctive color palette, notably for the devotees, the alchemists, and the anchorites, and strong concepts, bold choices with an extremely clear execution. Julien Moya mentions Philippe Drouillet, co-founder of famous science fiction magazine Métal Hurlant, as a strong inspiration for the color palettes. This radical aspect, to borrow a word often used by Julien Moya, is softened by the purity of the lines. It's a wireframe rendering, the edges are visible, which also unify the different floors, as does the discrete texture made of diagonal lines. Sometimes the lines become irregular, they are no longer parallel in several areas that are a little apart, where the adventure begins, for example, and in the mine on the alchemist's floor, but the lines remain limpid and every screen in the game is fascinatingly clear and measured. The fact that the emphasis is done on the structure, since the lines are visible, reinforces, albeit indirectly, what Julien Moya says about the languages and the worlds, that they are symbols. It's not a matter of realism, of accuracy, since the peoples are often created from a blend of several architectures, several musical inspirations, and I find that the apparent structure, in addition to underlining the elegance and purity of the forms, also conveys this symbolic character through the distance it brings. In addition to this, other elements are based on simple geometric shapes, such as the materials falling in the mine, mere parallelepipeds, and even the control panels are pared down. When Starfield was released, I saw these screenshots showing some of the consoles, the doors, and the beer and whiskey juice boxes, but it's true that they don't look half as nice. And they were very convincing. You want to touch the buttons, you want to see the mechanisms moving. In Chants of Sennaar, those same elements are reduced to their simplest expression, which is logical. They have to be consistent with the overall style, their symbols too. This simplicity is an illustration of the priority given to efficiency during the development. For instance, when a character throws a stone to distract the attention of an NPC, we don't see the stone, only the front of the sound wave, which is the most useful. The UI is just as simple and elegant, with only one element always visible on the screen, and the sound design, particularly that of the keyboard, is discrete, further enhancing the success sound effects, which are more focused on the idea of the key, the padlock that opens. This purity at each level also gives a feeling of clarity that's really successful, since it highlights what's necessary to understand the languages. Observation allows us to decode. Of course, for the sake of readability, since everything is centered on the idea of deciphering, the game must resort to emphasis. Apart from the playable character, the attitudes and sound design of the peoples are very explicit, emphatic. You can see and hear very quickly whether a people is kind or aggressive. The devotees in front of the door are obviously distressed, the music lover gently nods their head for quite some time, laughters are very loud, the bards sometimes perplexed. Why do we want to ascend? They do enjoy teasing us. By the way, at the end, when they are all together and the symbols corresponding to the divinities of each people appear one after the other, one of the bards has a very amusing, asymmetrical, rather unnatural posture, mixing their astonishment and the sophistication they embody, whereas the warriors will naturally point at the symbol of duty. They are gameplay elements in their own right. They are necessary in order for us to decode. The other tools are equally emphatic. Statues or monuments, frescoes, slogans, a farce, sentences must be short and effective, attitudes perfectly readable. It's quite different with the alchemists, as their puzzles require to understand how their research work, including their numbering system. This emphasis is obviously reflected in the graphics. For the warriors in particular, everything is huge and very angular. Almost everything is based on vertical lines and planes. There are lots of shelves and books, and rectangles or parallelepipeds act as protections or bridge, rarely disturbed by a circle. Alchemists are much more pragmatic. Their work is clearly visible, but is shown differently, with more emphasis on organization rather than hierarchy. Warriors often follow cycles, are swamped with work and orders, and are associated with a form of accumulation. There are many crates and bottles brought in by trolley almost constantly, which may imply that their treasure is the result of constant plundering. The alchemist's work is focused on research, creating energy to open the door. That cannot be based on cycles, rather on study and trial and error. Infrastructures are more visible and functional: laboratories, a library, a restaurant, a map, and the sound design highlights metal. Some areas are reminiscent of factories, the large windows for example, and everything is useful. The alchemists live in a workplace. We see hooks, what look like chimneys, pillars with rivets, beams, light bulbs, cans. They're constantly in a place of research and work, whereas the bards, on the other hand, hide everything that has to do with labor, bathing in visual opulence. Their architecture is more ornate, the vegetation is luxuriant, and sonic opulence. I'll come back to the bards a little later. There are also sonic codes. In the few stings, when you discover a secret place or at the start of some of the puzzles, the success fanfare, and above all, the infiltration musics. There are 3 floors whose gameplay involves infiltration: the devotees, the warriors, and the alchemists. With the devotees, the first stealth phase happens with the kid on his initiative and involves no violence, not even implied. You're simply ejected if you fail. The music, while softer than the other pieces associated with the devotees, has a bit of mischief to it, and given that there are percussion instruments with definite pitches, the piece still feels very melodic. It's a game for the child. In the case of the warriors, I'd say that a good third of the floor has to be explored without being spotted. As they're quite bellicose people, and despite the fact that violence is never shown, we suspect that they will be less accommodating than the devotees. The change of mood is therefore very clear. It's still tonal, we're in E minor, but the difference is striking. Thomas Brunet uses a wide range of techniques for the strings, tremolos, harmonics or notes played sul ponticello, more aggressive bowing, which are treated as small musical gestures, short cells that build up, giving a rather unpredictable character to the infiltration layer. The first beat of each bar is almost systematically marked by percussion, which brings a form of constraint. The bass clarinet reinforces the anxiety-inducing atmosphere. We also heard it a lot during the stealth sequences in Planet of Lana. Its color lends itself well to this. And notably we hear voices, like conversations the warriors would have in the middle of a round, as well as another, somewhat strange vocal part. In the second part, the oboe expresses the hero's lament, taking up the opening phrases slightly simplified. The treatment of the cello in this second part is very interesting, with a particularly nice voiced cello glissando. And at the end we hear fourths and fifths that give a strange effect, as if only the oboe were truly humanized and all the other instruments were non-human, inorganic. With the alchemists, the infiltration is due to the monsters, not the people themselves. The musical loop is used in the transition zone. It begins in the labyrinth with the bards and carries on with the alchemists in the hide-and-seek phases with the monsters. The piano and the woodwinds give it a slightly more melodic character than in the Warriors, but the use of small, unpredictable cells and tactile gestures on the strings remains. Once again, the scansion of the percussion and the ultimately rather static piano, confined to a quasi-ostinato, easily illustrate the tension of this entire sequence. So, strictly speaking, there are no surprises in the music. The Warriors' introductory fanfare is rather obvious. And the piece accompanying the bard's farce is quite popular in its repetition of a short, not too melodic motif, but I'll come back to this later. The main musics of the alchemists play on the two aspects that are very much alluded to on this floor. More developed puzzles based on the machines that the alchemists use on a daily basis with cogs of science and its gradual startup. And the narrative operated in the library. We discover the tower's last people and the creation of the door, as well as the lost relationship between bards and alchemists in Temple of Knowledge. This is perfectly normal and contributes to the emphasis I mentioned earlier, but it would be reductive to limit ourselves to this, as we can find little twists in these codes, details introducing elements that are a little unexpected or departing from the initial codes in the expected. For example, when the chime takes us to a game of hide-and-seek, we hear a very festive piece, treated as a fugue. I'll come back to this point in the last part of the video. A rather voluble moment in which, however, the harp and piano bring a lot of softness to the conclusion. On a larger scale, one of the reasons why the music departs from the initial codes is because the narrative introduces us to other, less obvious facets of the tower's peoples. But to get to the heart of the matter, we first need to talk about what keeps the inhabitants of Sennaar confined: hierarchy. From the moment we enter the first floor of the tower after helping the devotee in the waterways, the references to hierarchy multiply. This is the first thing we learned from the frescoes. They are the humans, the devotees, the floor we're on, the warriors, and God. This hierarchy is incomplete as we soon realize that each people is focused on those around them, crushed in spite of themselves by this organization. Some peoples have words for those who are not their direct neighbors, but the relationship is often much stronger, positively or negatively, between direct neighbors, especially among warriors, surrounded by the impures and the chosen ones, but with the scientists still in their vocabulary. This relationship is not necessarily illustrated by the name of the people. Bards deny entry to the warriors without giving them a negative name, but they despise some of their fellow bards. But it's true that on the devotees' floor at the very bottom of the tower, hierarchy seems strongest. It permeates some puzzles, the one at the entrance to the church, for example, or the card game near the door closed by the warriors, a little more than everywhere else. This is logical. It describes, it establishes how the tower works. The higher you are, the better you are perceived, and since the devotees are unfortunately at the very bottom, we can assume that they are despised or ignored by all the other peoples. Since they suffer most from this hierarchy, we find it even more than on the other floors. We could also see in this the idea that knowledge allows us to progress. We can also note that they are the only people invaded by another, since the warriors are encroaching on their floor, guarding the door. Nevertheless, references are numerous everywhere else and generally imposing through statues and frescoes. Surprisingly, in a place where an overwhelming hierarchy controls all the relationships, we are not really seen in negative light. Admittedly, we have to hide among the warriors, but one might also think that it's because they have things to hide, and the bards, without rejecting us, may look down on us, but we're not the only ones they make fun of. Do we, however, feel safer in the sewers? We can move about relatively freely among the devotees, apart from the abbey entrance. The first contact, although not really friendly, is nevertheless polite and kind, and the devotee doesn't close the door behind him, which gives us access to the interior of the tower. We are not invited in, but we're not prevented either, and the first sentence, uttered by the devotee, "You help me," is an illustration of the hero's mission: help the tower. Later, the alchemists spontaneously offer to help us during our first conversations with them. We work alongside them in the laboratories, but they don't mind. They might seem indifferent at first, but they know how to be considerate. It's hard to say, however, that we're really welcomed. The anchorites won't even talk to us. Most of them are locked in their exile, which turns out to be Varian, Rundisk's first game. But this ties in with what I was saying earlier. The playable character, whose nature is probably a little strange, he's a creation, a key, is immediately shown as someone apart in the tower, and it seems that all the peoples feel the same way. This is easy enough to guess since he doesn't follow any of the people's codes, wearing different clothes, keeping his slightly stooped posture. He comes from elsewhere, and the peoples treat him with less certainty, which also makes it possible to underline their own character, beyond the tower's codes. How do they react to a stranger who is neither above nor below them? The child gets rid not only of the hierarchy, but also the somewhat distant, albeit kind attitude the devotees currently have towards the hero, challenging him to a game of hide-and-seek, expressing the trust he puts in him without the slightest hesitation. Until now, the hero has been given orders. Devotees use the imperative, "You, help me," but the child turns the order into play, "Follow me" or "Catch me," and thanks become a joyful congratulation. He sweeps away the established order, which everyone follows, and brings, positively, disorder in the tower. His impish sound design contrasts with that of the devotees, and the scene in which he leaves us is quite amusing from this point of view, as his voice echoes joyfully in the courtyard, while the silent devotees march in step in an imperturbable square. Without being a central character, he is important and brings something positive to the hero, a non-judgmental look, accepting him instantly through play, as well as valuable help in the last part. He is the only character to whom the hero seems to speak at the end of the game. After the hero has connected all the peoples, the child connects him to these very peoples as he finally includes the hero in the dialogue from which, paradoxically, the latter had always kept himself aloof. He listened without speaking, translated without taking part in the conversation. As the playable character always ends up alone in areas where he keeps a low profile, with peoples who, without being truly malevolent, are based on a hierarchy to which he does not belong and which condemns some of the inhabitants, the bell ringer, the bards with a blue mask, there's always music that feels more introspective, mixing a form of serenity, that of being alone in unfamiliar places where you're just passing through, or abandon, the hero perhaps indulging in invisible but understandable emotions as he witnesses some more or less praiseworthy behavior coming from Sennaar's peoples. For example, in the zone on the warrior's floor where we find the observatory and the bell ringer, we are freed from the constraint of acting like one of them. We no longer have to follow the orders. And we discover areas that are little apart, almost empty. It's mainly the flute that accompanies this gentler exploration, contrasting with the warrior's infiltration music. Similarly, as we approach the treasure room, we discover a fresco recounting the history of the warriors. It's an important narrative element. The music in this area is therefore less intimate than that of the observatory and the ringer. It's here that the voice is actually first heard in Chants of Sennaar's score. The same is true for the devotees. Inside the abbey, the music is softer, but it's especially near the cemetery that a certain simplicity accompanies the last puzzle, a simplicity very well translated by Sylvain Millepied on the flute, who here strays from a classical technique for a slightly breathier tone and plays on the intonation to color the notes. Some of them are a bit too flat, but it's a musical and emotional context that lends itself perfectly to this. On the alchemist's floor, we enter the mine gently despite the danger. Indeed, we are far away from everything. As we make our way to the next puzzle, the alchemists can be seen in the background, involved in their discussions. Despite their kindness, none of them can really help us. It's up to us, and us alone, to connect the peoples. The middle section accompanies the discovery of the mine, its dangers, its puzzles, with evocative percussion like stones or flints struck together, and maintains a fine balance between the tranquility of a free exploration, the softness of some phrases, and a rhythmic support always present through the percussion, but also other interventions like this cell on the cello, and all the other motifs that joyfully structure the piece. This is in keeping with the sound design of the floor, which is more focused on mechanisms, given that the puzzles require us to use all the alchemist's machines. There is, however, one flaw that struck me as richer than the others in terms of narrative, a flaw in which the hero will discover a little more than elsewhere the distress of some of Sennaar's inhabitants, a flaw where the music will move from opulence to a form of complaint. It's the bard's flaw. On the warrior's floor, we spend a significant part of the exploration undercover, with consequently the same color palette and the same music, then we obey the orders of the other warriors. As a result, there are few moments and musics when we can breathe a little in the few areas where we are unsupervised. Apart from the softer musics I mentioned in the previous section, exploration is often done without music. After the bell puzzle, we quickly leave the warrior's floor for the bards. The silence, barely disturbed by the crackling of the fire, is replaced by numerous bird songs before the floor's first music begins. It brings back two things. Stability, this is an area in which we won't have to hide directly, even though we'll be exploring the sewers, since having a rather long piece of music fairly quickly can seem reassuring. It's also much more positive than the warrior's introductory fanfare. And above all, it brings back opulence. The bards are immediately presented as aesthetes. They love art, most of all they love beauty. On the next floor, a Rosetta Stone underlines something interesting by translating the following text. You, the alchemists, seek. We, the bards, have found. We can see in this a form of contentment. Beauty is enough for them. They enjoy it, even indulge in it. Perhaps this is why there was a split between the alchemists and the bards, who were once brothers, as we learn in the Alchemist's Library. The latter don't seem to want to explore, confining themselves to their tower floor, enjoying playing theatre, making music and mocking the monsters and those they call idiots. That's understandable. The next floor is partly invaded by actual monsters, and those who try to ascend probably perished. Why would they now want to leave? While the play makes a mockery of the idiots who try to ascend, it can also be seen as a form of catharsis. Mocking those who died can help us accept their fate, the split with their brothers, and the fact that they can no longer join the alchemists. Not everyone is happy, though. Those who work for the bards, the idiots in other words, wear blue masks and different clothes. They serve them, do the cleaning, live hidden away near the sewers. They can't take part in the fun. The idiot bard in the farce wears the mask of the idiots, but the skirt of the bards, so perhaps they're a bard disguised as an idiot, or an idiot cruelly mocked, a bard who would have become an idiot and whose social decline would be highlighted by a change of outfits. In any case, the real idiot is only allowed to sweep up after the performance. Under the mill, however, a small room shelters their claim to freedom. While beauty and art are celebrated, work is hidden. On the devotees' floor, craftsmen and merchants were in the abbey, visible to all. Here the luthier repairs instruments near the sewers, and all the places associated with work have a common color palette, far less varied than that of the gardens. Apart from the floor's first piece and the music of the farce, we can hear Gardens of Plenty and Envers. The composer emphasized in an interview how much he enjoyed composing the music for this zone, and it's easy to hear. Gardens of Plenty is the longest piece, it's 7.5 minutes long. If we hear it on the surface among the bards, it is perhaps there that, for me, the complaint of the enslaved bards is finally expressed, as they endure the contempt and teasing of their fellow bards. It's a rather long piece, mixing several influences. It seems to me that we hear through singing at the very beginning, with a rich polyphony, thus recalling the opulence of the place, the sophistication of the bards. But above all, it seems completely divided. After 3 minutes, the choir and the solo voice intervene, and I always get the impression that at this point, the piece starts again, taking a completely different direction. This is the case rhythmically as we move from a simple to a compound rhythm, as if the choir were appropriating the music to make its complete heard. The treatment of the voice is particularly touching, as usually, without being entirely melismatic. It is very organic in the phonemes used. In this piece, on the contrary, it is much more clearly syllabic, and its rhythm is very regular. A discourse, a pain wants to be heard, reinforced by each intervention of the instrumentalists, like impulses impossible to contain, each dissonance in this moving polyphony. There's notably Sylvain Millepied's piccolo solo, which plays on the use of flatted zunge and portamenti to get to the very edge of the sound. It often switches to the lower octave, but this is undoubtedly deliberate. So the idea of pain is very concrete, but the stripped-down nature of this solo is followed by the return of the choir, the voice, transcending the previous complaint in a beautiful contrast. The instruments are complete in a rich polyphony. The opulence of the bards, their care for aestheticism, is once again evident as we bathe in this elaborate counterpoint, but in the end the voices impose themselves without ever being alone, sublimating the pain of those who, for who knows what reason, would have deserved to be called idiots, perhaps giving an expression, for want of an actual speech, to those who only really know the other side of this scenery that seems made for aesthetes. But if those gardens deprive them of their freedom, giving voice only to their complaint, it's in the sewers, far from the bards, that they finally express themselves, peer to peer, bard to bard. But in the end, are they the only ones to weep? The only ones to lament over freedom? Bards, are you sure you have found? Envers accompanies our exploration of the sewers, where the idiot bards work. In the sewers, there are no puzzles strictly speaking, you just follow the various paths, along which you discover a few secrets, the main objective being to retrieve a compass that a bard dropped earlier. The network is a bit labyrinthine, there are dead ends, but you don't get stuck for long, you can just take another route. Envers begins in a very stripped-down way, as the cello states the musical phrase on which the piece is built, a little like a piece based on a ground bass, although it's not really what we have here. Right up to the end of the piece, the counterpoint is gradually enriched, while at the same time having stages, very striking moments when the addition of an instrument proves particularly compelling. I think this is one of the pieces that most captures the horizontality that the hero brings to the tower. If we return briefly to Journey, one of the key notions of the game is hierarchy, both within the game with the ancestors and the travelers, and between travelers via the color of the dress and the embroideries, coupled with transmission with an emphasis on verticality. The ancestors speak, we listen, but we teach them things in return, at least we show them how to apprehend the cloth creatures. This verticality can be heard in essence in the way the theme is solemnly stated by the cello, then taken up by the alto flute before the orchestra enters. Everyone seems to receive the theme, to learn it, in order to pass it on in turn, just as the players do with the location of the glowing symbols and the habits in co-op, like the heart on the snow at the end of the adventure. It's not the same thing in Chants of Sennaar, where the hero is almost alone to put an end to the verticality of the tower and connect the peoples. So it's a counterpoint that I feel differently. I don't hear any hierarchy at all between the instruments, which doesn't mean they're all on the same level from a compositional point of view, but I really see it as the communion of an ensemble. Of course, there are moments of communion in Journey too. This is undoubtedly one of the aspects of the game when hierarchy gives way to the union with the universe and the creatures of the game, but the function and the posture of the hero of Chants of Sennaar are so specific that the music must illustrate this, which is also why the choice of small ensembles is so relevant. We hear the recreation of a lost dialogue, and Envers might be the most striking example of this dialogue, as if the enslaved bards, safe in the sewers, could at last let themselves go and improvise. The area allows for this, as there are no puzzles, just slightly labyrinthine exploration, but not too much. Music can take up more space. Moreover, in Chants of Sennaar, the music is completely written, so there's no interactivity of it with the gameplay, as there is for chirping and co-op, among other things, in Journey. I can imagine it makes the construction of the pieces easier. Finally, while the bards are constantly singing their love for beauty, there is sometimes a kind of refusal of this beauty, a search for something rawer, less aestheticized, for a material that is not always frozen in a kind of perfection, whether through the work on tones or the phrasing, if only the cello solo that opens Envers. Hidden beneath the surface, far away from the judgment of the bards, we can finally play with abandon more than ever. For people to be connected, they need to have something in common. There's a certain stability to the people's vocabulary, at least a core that can be found logically enough on every floor, apart from the warriors who don't even greet each other. In particular, music is virtually omnipresent in the tower. The translation stele, a kind of Rosetta Stone in various forms, often found near an interface between two floors, hidden near a teleportation portal, or on the contrary prominently displayed, forbidding entry to a hated people, anticipate the links recreated by the playable character, as they do not only concern adjacent floors. For example, there's an inscription mixing the languages of the devotees and the bards, as well as another showing fragments of warrior symbols mentioning the freedom of the abbey's devotees. The enslaved bards seek this freedom. The steles give a past to this now frozen tower. Interestingly, two of them respond to each other. The one mixing glyphs from the devotees and the bards reads, "I sought you, you found me," implying an ancient link between the two peoples, a link now broken in the image of the stele found in pieces. Later, on the alchemist's floor, the stele I mentioned earlier about bards and alchemists reads, "You seek, we have found." These sentences have no complement, as if the two quests were pointless. What are the alchemists seeking? What have the bards found? That's why the brothers turned their backs on each other. It's worth noting that it's the playable character who reactivates the terminals, serving as both teleportation and translation points. They seem to have been built specifically for him, since they're surrounded by two silhouettes similar to that of the hero. Also, we can see that devotees and warriors wear clothes with similar colors, or the garments take up colors from the color palette of each zone, and in the case of the first two peoples, they are essentially dressed in red and blue-green, with, of course, very angular armor elements for the warriors, contrasting with the rounder silhouette of the devotees. However, this is no indication of a prior link between the two peoples. The playable character also picks up on these colors with his red tunic and the green bracelets or tattoos on his arms. By contrast, the bards and alchemists, once brothers but now estranged, wear very different clothes. Finally, while each zone has a well-defined sonic color and will develop rather specific instruments or families of instruments, the presence of a fairly constant core, with strings and flute notably very much used, gives a lot of cohesion to the entire score, implicitly alluding to a former unity alas now vanished. In an interview for Now Playing, Thomas Brunet explained that he had used a rhythmic idea throughout the score. repeating musical cells but modifying them very slightly so as to give the impression that a contact is being established, the composer mentioning a babel, a proto-dialogue between instruments. It seems to me that this idea can be found on several scales. The most obvious illustration of this, though not necessarily the one mentioned by the composer in the interview, is the pieces treated in canon or fugato, notably Catch Me and A Bit of Fun. This writing is somewhat ambivalent. You can see a certain order in it through the systematic repetition of musical phrases, all the more so for the most rigorous contrapuntal forms, shall we say, which follow rules, but the richness of the counterpoint and the multiplication of voices can, depending on the context, lead to something more overflowing. In Catch Me, the use of this technique, a fugal form here supposedly imperfect, shall we say, brings into the music the joyful disorder of the game with the child, a joyful disorder both amplified and contrasted by other elements. On the one hand, it's reinforced by the introduction of the winds, starting with the oboe and its precise articulation, then the clapping. The generous tutti in the second half of the piece, culminating in a virtuosic line on the strings and piccolo. On the other hand, it's softened by lines with longer rhythmic figures or the use of the harp, bringing softness to the overall sound. The balance is created, the disorder is welcomed. For A Bit of Fun, the supposedly diegetic music of the Bards farce, the choice of this technique is reinforced by the very popular character of the piece, based on the systematic repetition of a very dynamic gesture, a chant cell that is ultimately not very melodic. A fine example of this type of repetition is the theme of the first boss of Rayman Legends, the medieval dragon, composed by Christophe Herral, in which the orchestra repeats the theme stated by the piccolo to the point of obsession, and concludes the third phase in farandole as liberating as the battle against the imposing creature. In Thomas Brune's piece, the tempo is faster, the meter is irregular, it's 5/8 or 5/4, and the bass motif is even shorter, accentuating its almost improvised feel, underlined by several notes played with a lot of character, such as this slightly longer C, or the G sharp, very long and straight, abrupt and amusing. I also really like the slightly suspended effect on the E, then on the D, when the piccolo and the violin play the motif in unison. The fact that there are tiny variations on the motif also illustrates the idea of oral traditions. The bard's floor highlights traditions that are much less written than those of the alchemists, the latter, on the contrary, being focused on study, research, which requires patience and a thorough recording of their results. The bards are more in search of the moment of pleasure, at least that's what they show at first. But this idea of a proto-dialogue can be found on other scales. For example, on the devotee's floor, after the opening music, Out of the Cavern and Into the Light, the music for the very first zone is this one. At first, we arrive in a welcoming zone, leaving behind the somewhat intriguing waterways that familiarize us with the first words for a warmer, more lived-in place. So we remember that the very first music of the devotees has this feeling of expectation and opening. We then discover the frescoes, the death of humans and plants, the hope embodied by the tower and this god at the very top, then the warrior's decision to seal the door, a door we'll see just a few moments later. The second music thus contrasts with the first. What's interesting about this piece is that, while the dialogue is very short scale at the beginning in response, the phrases supposedly played in homophony are very slightly out of sync. There's a micro delay and instability. Unison ultimately proves difficult in the Tower of Babel. Finally, on a larger scale, there is, of course, the repetition of specific themes with a very slightly different rhythm, again like a distortion due to an unwritten transmission. Sometimes it's on a very short scale, one after the other. But quite often it's from one piece to the next, as when we hear the very first musical phrase of the game, slightly modified on the devotee's floor or later in Temple of Knowledge. This also makes it possible to play on the union between diegetic and non-diegetic music, as when we hear in Gardens of Plenty the part played a little earlier by one of the bards to their friend in the gardens themselves. There is no modification of the score in this case, however. It's not surprising, of course, that the themes run through the entire score, but it's a nice illustration both of the playable character's function. We find the motif that introduced him and the tower right up to the end of the OST, so he connects the different musics, and of the bonds that are being reformed between peoples, like the recreation of the symbol. The hierarchy disappears and it's no longer a matter of inferiority or superiority, since the requests when we recreate the links in the terminals are more based on help or mutual aid. We do hope that the warriors won't be killed by the monster on the alchemist's floor though. Like the setting in the last part of the game, everything is turned upside down. Each people will recreate a link with the others, and it's the sign of this cohesion that appears at the top. It looks like the three-dimensional representation of a graph whose vertices, the nodes, are the peoples of Sennaar, a graph that is now complete. Each vertex is connected to the other four. Each one of these peoples can be the vertex of the Tower of Babel. This graph is moving. The tower is no longer static, it is no longer fixed in its structure, in its relationships, in its verticality. It has been symbolically and peacefully abolished. Thank you for watching this video. As you might have noticed, I first published it in French. I mentioned it in my short update video. I'm going to re-record all my previous analyses in French, but don't worry, I'll publish the new videos both in English and in French. The next analysis will be devoted to the discrete poetry of Domekeeper, after which I'll start publishing the French versions of my old videos, and as soon as I can resume the new analysis, there will be Little Nightmares 2, Celeste and Jusant. This order might change. Okay, thanks again and goodbye!